Colonel Weston Farr pulled the maintenance log from Nadia Sullen's hands and dropped it on the briefing room table like it was something he'd found on the bottom of his boot. "This is a competition for active combat's snipers," he said, loud enough that the two rangers near the window turned to look. "Not a math class." He tapped the log with one finger. Nobody wants to see a forward observer running numbers on a whiteboard while the shooters shoot. Nobody in the room said anything. Nadia looked at the log on the table, then at Farr, and then she smiled. It was a quiet smile, the kind that doesn't ask for anything and doesn't offer anything and just exists as a fact in the air between two people. Farr would remember that smile for the rest of the week. He wouldn't say so out loud, but he would remember it. Subscribe to this channel. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The transport from Fort Bragg arrived at Marine Corps Base Quantico at 0615 on a Monday, and Specialist Nadia Sullen was the second to last off. Not because she was slow, because she'd learned years ago that the way you exit a vehicle in a new place tells the people watching. Whether you've thought about being watched, or whether you've been so focused on where you're going that you forgot to consider who'd be looking when you got there. She had thought about it. She stepped down onto the tarmac with her kit over her shoulder and a worn canvas case under her right arm that had no unit markings and no identifying patches, and that she held with the specific careful ease of someone carrying something that doesn't belong to the Army. The heat at Quantico in July is a different animal from the dry furnace of Fort Bragg. It's wet and close, and it finds you in places you thought were protected. Nadia had grown up in rural Nevada, where the heat came off the desert floor in waves you could see before you felt them. At least that heat was honest about its intentions. She respected honesty in weather. What she didn't respect was what she felt when she cleared the bottom step and the men on the tarmac looked up from their gear. There were 14 of them, 7 Marine Force Recon, 4 Army Rangers, 2 Navy SEALs, and 1 Air Force combat controller named Pearson, whose reputation preceded him by about 8 time zones. They all knew a female specialist had been cleared for the Inter-Service Precision Shooting Invitational. They'd known for 2 weeks. But knowing a thing and seeing it standing in front of you with a canvas case and an expression that doesn't ask for their approval are different animals entirely. 2 of the Marines resumed their conversation. 3 of the Rangers looked at each other. One of the SEALs, a blocky man named Farr, who was a full colonel attending as an evaluator rather than a competitor, picked up his own kit and turned away with the specific body language of a man who has already made up his mind. Chief Warrant Officer Delphine Rourke was waiting at the check-in table. She was a lean woman in her late 50s, with the economy of movement that comes from long practice, and the expression of someone who has been assigned an awkward task and decided to perform it with dignity. "Specialist Sullen," she said, not extending her hand. "Welcome to Quantico." "Thank you, Chief Rourke. I'll need your primary weapon for baseline inspection." Nadia set the canvas case on the table and opened it with the particular unhurried care of someone performing a ritual rather than a task. Inside, nested in foam that had been cut to shape by hand rather than manufactured, lay a Remington 700 in .308 Winchester. The receiver was worn to a patina that only decades of handling produced. The wooden stock had been refinished twice, but bore the original checkering from the factory, deepened by 30 years of grip. The scope mount was empty. The scope rings were present, but what sat in them was not a scope. It was a set of target aperture iron sights that had been machined to fit the Picatinny rail, a modification so precise and so unusual that Rourke picked the rifle up, turned it over once, and set it down again before she spoke. "This is your competition weapon," she said. "Yes, specialist. The invitational parameters allow for personal firearms meeting caliber and action specifications. The equipment list includes optical sighting systems." "I know what the equipment list includes," Nadia said. Her voice was level. She'd learned that from her father. Keep it level. The moment your voice gives them a temperature to react to, they stop listening to what you're saying and start listening to how you're saying it. Keep it level, and they have to engage with the words themselves. Iron sights are not prohibited by the invitational parameters. Rourke wrote something on her clipboard with the careful penmanship of someone creating documentation they expect to be reviewed. Your lane assignment and housing are in Bay 3, she said. Building 7. Nadia picked up the rifle and walked toward Building 7. She heard the conversation start before she got through the door. The barracks were the standard single-room configuration, and the walls at Quantico were thin in the way of buildings built to be functional rather than private. Thin walls weren't barriers. They were membranes. Two voices, one young and certain, one older and careful. She brought the grandfather rig, the young one said. The older voice, I heard. You saw those sights? Looked like something out of a museum case. At least she'll have an excuse when she's pulling targets at 600 instead of hitting them. The older voice paused. She has a file, Davis. I read it. And 3 deployments. Afghanistan twice in Kandahar. Her last evaluation in Kandahar scored her at 94.7 on the long-range qualification, with iron sights. A pause. That's not possible. The older voice said nothing. Nadia set her kit on the cot and unpacked in the systematic order her father had taught her when she was 11 years old. Organization first. Everything in its place before you let yourself be anywhere other than where you are. She thought about her father. She did that a lot in new places where she was the only thing that looked like her. She heard the voice that belonged to Davis say, through the thin concrete, iron sights at Kandahar. Come on, 600 yards, in altitude. The older voice, whose name she didn't yet know, said only, read the file, Davis. Then she heard a door close. The invitational briefing was at 0700 in a low-ceilinged room that smelled like institutional coffee and the particular chemical neutrality of a space maintained for official functions. 16 competitors and 4 evaluating officers. Nadia was in the second row, and she was aware, in the peripheral way of someone who has spent years training peripheral awareness, that she was the only specialist in a room full of senior NCOs and officers, and the only woman, and that both of those facts were variables in the room's atmosphere regardless of whether anyone acknowledged them. General Arnold Keene ran the briefing. Nadia had read his file. Everyone in the room had read whatever version of it their clearance level permitted. What was publicly documented was sufficient to understand why he was standing at the front of the room at 62 years old, with the posture of a man 20 years younger. 40-year career. 2 combat commands. A Bronze Star with V device from an action in Mosul that the citation described in the careful, bloodless language of official recognition, but that men who had been there described differently. He looked at the room the way men look at rooms when they've stopped needing anything from the rooms they look at. He didn't look at Nadia differently from anyone else. That was unusual enough to notice. Welcome to the Precision Fire Invitational, he said. You're here because your record indicated you might deserve to be. The next 4 days will determine whether your record was accurate. He paused. One principle governs this week. Marksmanship is not equipment. Equipment is a platform. What you are is the structure the platform sits on. If the structure isn't sound, no platform improves it. Another pause. 4 days. 2 qualification phases daily. 1 scored challenge per day. Elimination on failure to complete a challenge. He looked at the room. Questions. Colonel Farr was in the front row. He raised a hand with the specific energy of a man who wants to be seen asking a question rather than a man who has a question. General, I notice that equipment logs show at least 1 competitor has submitted for qualification using non-standard iron sighting equipment. Is there a baseline optical standard we should be applying, or is equipment selection entirely at competitor discretion? The smile was in his voice rather than on his face. The men near him heard it. Keene looked at Farr for exactly 3 seconds. Iron sights are legal, he said. Iron sights are within specification. Iron sights have been winning wars since before you were born, Colonel. Next question. Farr sat back. He didn't look at Nadia. That was its own information. After the briefing, as competitors moved toward the equipment staging area, Nadia felt a hand touch her elbow, lightly. Once, she turned. Staff Sergeant Loren Vick was a black man in his mid-40s with close-cropped hair going gray at the temples and the build of someone who had been doing difficult physical work for 2 decades and had no interest in stopping. He had 23 years of service and eyes that showed it, which is to say they showed very little, because men who have seen what he had learned early, that the face is a transmission, and they chose what to broadcast carefully. Vic, he said, Army. I know, she said, because she'd read the files too. She extended her hand. He shook it. "Read your Kandahar evaluation," he said. "The 67-degree angle shot." "Yeah." He studied her for a moment. "My grandfather shot iron in Korea," he said. "Chosin Reservoir. 22 degrees below zero. He never told me what his hit rate was in those conditions. I never asked because I already knew the answer was something I wasn't supposed to be able to do math on." She looked at him. He had the expression of a man saying more than the words he was saying, which was its own kind of language, and she had learned to read it. They walked to the staging area together, and behind them she could feel the room's attention adjusting, recalibrating. The way a room adjusts when two things it had sorted into separate categories are revealed to have a connection it hadn't anticipated. The first qualification phase was a prone series. 20 targets, 200 to 600 yards, 2 minutes per target, scored on ring value. At these distances, in good conditions, an elite shooter with a quality optic should score in the high 90s. The lane assignments put Nadia in lane 9 and Far in lane 8, which meant he would have her performance in his peripheral vision for the duration of the phase. Whether that was intentional, she didn't spend time determining. She went prone, settled the rifle into position, and took 4 slow breaths to bring her heart rate to the numbers she needed. Not low for the sake of low. Low because low and steady was the mechanical environment in which the things her father had built into her nervous system performed at their specification. She looked through the iron sights at the first target at 200 yards, and it was small, smaller than optics-made targets appear, with the honest smallness of a target that isn't being magnified, just seen. The rear aperture framed it, the front post centered in that frame. She exhaled slowly, found the pause between exhale and inhale, where the body briefly becomes a stable platform, and broke the trigger. Clean. She cycled without checking. You don't check the first shot. The first shot happened or it didn't, and checking wouldn't change it. Shot 2, clean. On her left, she heard Far settling into position, heard the electronic chirp of his scope's zero conservance function, heard his first shot. 9, the scoring officer called. Good, not perfect. Her third shot was called a 10, center. She heard someone on the observation platform above make a sound that wasn't a word. Shot 6 at 300 yards. Shot 9 at 400. Each one in the rhythm she'd maintained since she was 9 years old, standing in the Nevada desert with her father, counting her breath from 8 feet behind her. Because he said the best way to learn to breathe right was to know someone was listening. The 400-yard shot at target 12 was the one that changed the composition of the silence around her. At 400 yards through iron sights, the margin for anything except technical perfection in your fundamentals is approximately 0. The front post is the width of a small coin relative to the target. The wind that day was a right-to-left push at 6 miles per hour with a gust pattern that came every 30 seconds and peaked at 9. She felt the pattern. She timed her entry into it. She broke the shot in the window between gusts. 10, center. From the platform, she heard a voice say something sharp and then cut off. In lane 8, Far had gone still, not between shots, which was normal, just still. Watching, she knew without looking because his rifle had been firing at a particular tempo, and that tempo had paused in the specific way of a rhythm, interrupted by something outside itself. Shot 15, 500 yards. Shot 18, 550. Shot 2600 into a wind that had picked up to 10 miles per hour with a variable shift that moved the component 15 degrees every 45 seconds. She tracked the shift. She didn't dial anything. She moved the front post relative to where she knew the target was and where she knew the bullet would be when they occupied the same space, and she fired. 10, center. The range master, a gunnery sergeant named Holt who had been running qualification ranges for 12 years, said nothing for 4 seconds after the call. Then, still looking at the target card, he said quietly to the man beside him, "You're seeing this, right?" Nadia stood, cleared her chamber, and looked at the scoring officer. "Perfect score," he said, not announcing it, just reading it. In the voice of someone reading a number they've read back 3 times, because the first 2 times didn't feel like enough confirmation. Nadia picked up her rifle and walked to the staging area. Behind her, she heard the information moving through the range, the way information moves through enclosed spaces, person to person, faster than announcement. Lunch. The mess at Quantico had the seating geography of a room where everyone had a position. Nadia carried her tray to a table near the east windows, and the space around her organized itself in the particular pattern she recognized from every assignment where she'd been the first of whatever she was. Not hostility, in most cases. More like a crowd giving distance to something it hadn't finished categorizing. Vic sat across from her after 2 minutes, which was 2 minutes less than she'd expected. 2 rangers who clearly found the politics tedious sat nearby. Farr was at the center table. She could catch his voice across the room without trying, because some voices project by design, and Farr's was one of them. She caught fragments, beginner's luck. The wind was favorable. Wait until the moving phase. Vic ate for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "He's going to escalate." He was already a problem, Nadia said. He didn't have a specific reason yet. Now he does. Vic looked at her. There's a difference between ambient and targeted. Yes, she said. When it becomes targeted, that's when you learn what the people around you are actually made of. He was quiet. Your father teach you that? She looked at him steadily. My father taught me the things that were worth knowing, she said. The rest I learned from being underestimated in rooms exactly like this one. He nodded slowly, in the way of men who understand something because they've lived an adjacent version of it. Then she set down her fork and said, without looking up, "Someone went through my kit last night." Vic's fork stopped. "Nothing taken," she said. "Nothing disrupted in a way that would register as evidence. But I pack in sequence, and the sequence was touched. A specific kind of touched. Careful. You're sure?" "Always." "Have you reported it?" She looked at him with the flat expression of someone whose answer to that question is already contained in the question itself. He understood. "I'll watch," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I told you." The afternoon qualification was a timed scenario. 12 targets, random appearance, distances from 250 to 550 yards, each visible for 7 seconds. Acquire, calculate, fire within the window, or score a 0. No recovery. It was the kind of phase that separated the people who had practiced their fundamentals until they were automatic from the people who had practiced them until they were almost automatic, and the gap between those two things only showed up when the clock was running. Nadia went prone in lane 9. First target appeared at 380 yards, offset right. She had it in the sights in the first second. The wind read was in the second. The synthesis, not calculation, synthesis. The thing that happens when you have done something so many times that the knowing lives below the thinking, happened in the third. She fired in the fourth. 10. Center. Second target, 260 yards, 7 seconds, center. Third target. She was aware in that expanded peripheral awareness that lane 8 had gone quiet in a way that wasn't the quiet of concentration. It was the quiet of watching. She fired. 10. By the 7th target, the observation platform had more people on it than had been there for the morning session. She could hear additional footsteps up there without trying. She didn't look up. Looking up was a request for acknowledgement. She wasn't making that request. She needed to shoot. 12th target, 530 yards. She breathed, felt the wind, felt the distance as a physical fact in her hands and her chest, and the accumulated data of her entire adult life. Fired in second 5. 10, center. The scoring officer called 12 for 12 and then looked at his card again, and then said 12 for 12 once more in a voice that suggested he was reading it back because the first time hadn't fully landed. Gunnery Sergeant Holt walked the line. He stopped at lane 9. He looked at the card. He looked at Nadia. He said nothing at all, and Nadia had been in enough rooms to know that sometimes nothing at all was the most complete response available. In lane 8, Farr's card showed 10 for 12, 91%. In any other context, that number would have led the board, would have generated the kind of comment that travels upward through a unit as evidence of exactly the right things. Today it was second. He stood at his lane for a moment after the line was cleared, not moving. Then he walked to the equipment staging area, and his jaw was set in the way that jaws set when a man is performing composure because the alternative is worse. That evening, she found what she was looking for in her kit, and it wasn't there. 35 rounds missing from her allocated ammunition. Not all of it. Not enough to constitute an obvious crime if she reported it. Enough to create a logistics problem in 2 of tomorrow's phases. If she couldn't source replacement. Deniable. Precise. The work of someone who understood supply chains and acceptable losses and how much disruption you could introduce into a competitor's preparation without triggering a formal complaint. She stood in the equipment room with the open case in her hands, and she felt something move in her chest that she had learned over 10 years of service to treat with care. Not anger exactly, the thing before anger, the pressure that builds. She breathed until it settled. Then she closed the case and went to knock on Vic's door. He opened it in 30 seconds. She told him what she'd found. He listened without interrupting, which told her what she already believed about him. "How short are you?" he said. 35 rounds. He turned and came back with a sealed box and handed it without ceremony, compatible caliber. Then he said, "You're not going to report this." "Not yet," she said. He studied her. "Whoever did this," she said, "will do it again because they'll think it worked. And when there's a pattern, the pattern is evidence. One missing case is a miscount. 3 missing cases is a campaign." His expression shifted very slightly, the shift of someone receiving confirmation of something they suspected. Then he said, "Your father dealt with this." She looked at the wall. "He spent 20 years dealing with it," she said. "People seeing what he could do and finding reasons why it didn't count. He qualified experts 17 consecutive years, and his commanding officer's last evaluation before his retirement described him as a capable marksman with technical proficiency." He paused. "Not remarkable, not exceptional, capable. A man who hit 97% of targets at 1,000 yards in the Nevada desert on a bet that 3 officers put up because they were sure he couldn't do it. Capable." Vic was quiet. His own record wasn't much different. She could see from his expression. She said, "His long-range certification records were never submitted to the National Personnel Registry. I found out 6 years after he died that the paperwork had been flagged for administrative review, and the review was never completed, and by the time anyone looked at it, the unit had been deactivated, and the files were in a box in a federal records facility in St. Louis. He should have been in the registry. He qualified for it 3 times over. Instead, he's a footnote." She paused. "I'm not here as a footnote." Vic held her gaze for a moment. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow will be harder." It was harder. The next morning, she found her lane assignment sheet was missing. Not lost. The space on her desk where she'd placed it the night before had been deliberately cleared. The rest of her kit was untouched. Someone had come into her room, taken one document, and left everything else in precise order. She stood in the center of the room for 8 seconds and did the mathematics of what that meant. They had access to her room. They'd used it twice, and the escalation from supply to intelligence indicated a level of planning that went beyond impulse. This was managed interference. She went to Vic's door, knocked twice. He opened it immediately. He was already dressed. She looked at him. "I have a copy," he said. "Get in." He had his assignment sheet, weighted down with a field knife on his desk. She saw that he'd made 2 copies. She saw that the second copy had been kept in his jacket pocket overnight. He handed it to her without ceremony. "Day 2, long-range series is at 0800, he said. "The stress fire was moved to 1000. The change went out on the update sheet last night. Nobody announced it. If you'd gone at the original time, you would have arrived at an empty range." She looked at him. "Automatic disqualification," she said. "Failure to report." He nodded. "Documented as performance failure. No indication of the interference." "It's clean," she said. "It's been used before. Men like Farr," Vic said carefully, "don't develop new methods. They refine the ones that haven't been caught yet." She folded the schedule into her chest pocket and buttoned it. "Thank you." "Just shoot," he said. She did. The 0800 long-range series was cold bore, 5 shots, distances called at the line by Holt, no advance warning. 400, 700, 550, 800, 920 in that order. The 400-yard shot went center. Holt's pen stopped moving for half a second before it resumed. The 700-yard shot, the kind of adjustment from 400 that the brain resists because it wants to undercorrect after a short distance, went center. The spotter 2 lanes over, a young Marine named Teague, who had been calling scores since day 1, said center and then looked at his pad as if confirming the number with the number he'd already written. The 920 shot was the one that broke the surface of the day's attention in a new way. At 920 yards with iron sights, the front post is wider than the target. You are not aiming at the target. You are aiming at the space that contains the target, trusting a calculation that doesn't live in your conscious mind because your conscious mind isn't fast enough or stable enough to do the work. Nadia held for 7 seconds. The range went so quiet that she could hear her own breath in the aperture. She fired. Dead center. The radio crackle came back, and Holt repeated it in a voice that had stopped trying to be neutral. Dead center. 920. From the observation platform above came a sound that wasn't organized or collective. It was individual. 12 separate people arriving at the same reaction without coordinating it. General Keene was on the platform. He had been there for the past 50 minutes, standing at the railing with his binoculars. Not moving, not speaking to the men beside him. The specific quality of attention that belongs to someone who has spent enough time at the far edges of human performance to recognize it when it appears, even in a form they weren't expecting. He turned to the man beside him, Brigadier General Owen Crest, the Invitational's senior administrative officer. Owen, Keene said quietly. I see it, Crest said at 9:20. I see it, Arnold. He put his binoculars back up. Below them, Nadia was already preparing for the next position, unhurried, settled, with the specific ease of someone doing the thing they were built to do. Where did she come from? Crest asked. Nevada, Keene said. Her father was a range master, self-taught. Crest was quiet for a moment. What was his name? Sullen, Keene said. Raymond Sullen. Elko County Range, 1987 through 2014. Crest's expression changed slightly in the specific way of a man hearing a name from an unexpected direction. I know that name, he said. Most people don't, Keene said. That's the problem. Below them, Nadia fired again. Center, Farr had stopped shooting. He was standing at his lane with his rifle at his side watching. His face was doing the internal arithmetic of a man being proved wrong by evidence he had already decided was insufficient before the evidence arrived, and discovering that the evidence doesn't care what he decided. Vic, 3 lanes to her right, caught her eye, gave a single nod, the kind of nod that gets reserved for moments that deserve acknowledgement and don't need amplification. She returned it. The next day brought the moving target phase, and by now the shape of the week had become clear to everyone on the range. Nadia was first on the board, not by a margin that could be explained by luck or favorable conditions, by the kind of margin that forces a different conversation. Farr was fourth. He sat in front of the board for 11 seconds without moving. Then he turned and walked out. The door closed behind him with the careful, controlled precision of a man saving his force for something specific. Vic, standing beside her at the board, said, "Fourth place is eating him alive." "I know," she said. "You don't seem concerned." "Concern lives in my hands if I let it," she said. "When the range closes, concern becomes preparation." He looked at her. "What are you preparing for?" "Whatever he's planning," she said. "He made a phone call last night that the service restriction on this base should have made impossible, which means someone with access gave him access, and he's done arguing. Men who are done arguing start arranging." She paused. I'm not afraid of him. I just need to understand the geometry of what he's setting up before it's set up, and if you can't, I deal with what comes," she said. Same as always. That night, Keene called her to his office. The office was in the back of the range administration building and smelled like a room where real work had been done for a long time. 2 files on the desk. He gestured to the chair across from him and she sat. "Captain Sullen," he said, and then corrected himself immediately. "Specialist Sullen, how much do you know about your father's record?" The question arrived in the room with weight behind it. She felt it in her chest, in the specific way of pressure that comes from a subject you've carried long enough that other people touching it surprises you. "What's in his service file?" she said carefully, "and what he told me before he died." "What did he tell you?" "That he never thought he'd get to come home." She stopped. "That the men he trained with came back and got their recognitions, and he came back and what he got was a handshake from a contracting officer who said he was welcome to re-enlist at his current grade. He never understood why. He thought it was something he'd done. He told me that once, and I was 17, and I didn't know what to say to him, and I've thought about it every day since." Keene turned one of the files so she could see it across the desk. "Your father's long-range qualification records," he said. "The originals, filed by his range commander, Master Sergeant Dale Pruitt, in 1991. He paused. Your father qualified for inclusion in the National Precision Fire Registry in 1987, 91, and 1994. The applications were submitted all 3 times. He looked at her. The 1987 application was lost in a regional records consolidation. The 91 application was received at the national level and placed in administrative review. The reason noted in the file: the confirming witness signature was from an NCO rather than a commissioned officer, and the standing policy at the time required commissioned officer confirmation. She went very still. He was the only trained long-range evaluator in the county, she said. He was the range master. There was no commissioned officer who could evaluate what he was submitting for confirmation because he was the person who did evaluations. Yes, Keene said, which meant the confirmation requirement couldn't be met, which meant the application sat. He closed the file gently. The 1994 application was submitted during a period when the registry's processing office was being relocated. It arrived in a batch of 1,200 documents and was logged but never reviewed. By the time the processing office was fully operational at its new location, the application window for that cycle had closed. It wasn't destroyed, he said. It was never lost on purpose. It was buried under the specific weight of a bureaucracy that wasn't designed to account for situations it hadn't anticipated, and it stayed buried long enough to be functionally identical to never having existed. She looked at the desk, at her father's name on a form from 1991 typed in a font that belonged to a world she knew from photographs rather than memory. Why are you telling me this now? She said. Because of what I've watched you do on this range, Keene said, and because I think you should know the full truth about your father before this week is over. He looked at her directly. And because the truth has some things that can still move in response to it. She looked up. I've been in contact with the National Personnel Records Center, he said. There are provisions for posthumous registry inclusions when documentation supports the original qualification. The process requires a senior officer's advocacy and approximately 60 to 90 days. He let that settle. I'm prepared to initiate that process. She held his gaze. You would do that. What you're doing on that range, he said, and his voice had the quality of a man choosing his words, the way a shooter chooses a hold point, not fast, but exactly, is not performance. It's inheritance. You're showing what your father taught you on a rifle that carries what he touched every day for 30 years, in a room full of people who didn't understand what they were looking at until you made them look more carefully. The least I can do is make sure his name ends up in the right file. She looked at the desk, at his files, at her father's application form with the incomplete processing stamp and the reference number that had gone nowhere for 30 years. She thought about him standing in the Nevada heat at 6 in the morning, the ground already baked from the day before, crouching beside her with the rifle nearly taller than she was, teaching her to hold before she knew what holding was. You are not aiming at the target, he had told her. You are deciding. The target just receives the decision. She'd thought that was philosophy. By her second deployment, she understood it was mechanics. Thank you, she said, and she meant it in the full weight of the word, not as courtesy but as acknowledgement that something she had carried without knowing quite how to set it down had been seen by someone with the authority and the will to do something about it. She stood, Keene stood. Specialist, he said, one more thing. She waited. There is something happening in this competition beyond marksmanship. I think you already know what I mean. I know what you mean, she said. I need you to trust that it's being addressed, he said, not by you, by the people whose responsibility it is. She looked at him, at a man who had earned 38 years of people's trust and understood that trust was not given. It was built, and it could not be transferred, only demonstrated. Yes, she said, I can do that. She walked out into the Quantico evening, where the air had finally started to cool, and she walked at exactly the pace she always walked, because the day her pace changed for someone else's agenda was a day she was planning to postpone indefinitely. But something had shifted in the weight she was carrying. Not lifted, redistributed, made bearable by being named out loud by someone who had decided to do something about the naming. She found Vic waiting at the edge of the staging area when she came back from the building. He'd been told something. She could see it in the set of his face, which was the face of a man who has received information, and is deciding how to deliver it. Farr pulled Davis and one other, Martinez, the Marine from Pendleton, out of the afternoon free window yesterday, Vic said. Talked to them privately for about 12 minutes. They're not close. They're deferential to him. That's a more useful category. She thought about what Keene had said, about trusting the people whose job it was. What's the final day's challenge format, she said. Keene hasn't announced it. But based on range setup this morning, he paused. It's a cold bore cumulative series, escalating distance, no reset between shots, starting at 400. She thought about that. The range record for the series is 11 of 13 completed, he said. Nobody has ever hit all 13. At what maximum distance? 1,500 yards, he said. She looked at him, with iron sights. She said it as a statement rather than a question. He nodded. She looked at the range, at the distance markers and the wind flags and the last of the evening light moving across the target still hanging from the afternoon session. Then we'll be ready, she said. What does ready look like? She thought about Keene's words. Ready looks like the cleanest shooting I've ever done, she said, and letting everything else be handled by the people who are supposed to handle it. Vic was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Your father teach you that? She looked at him. He taught me that the only ground you can actually own is the ground between your breath and the trigger. Everything outside that, she said, you prepare for, you account for, and then you let it be what it's going to be. She picked up the rifle. The iron sights caught the last of the evening light the way iron always catches light, simply, cleanly, without interpretation. They were always there. They were always honest. The morning of the final day came in clear and still. The storm that had rolled through the night before had left behind the specific quality of air that follows serious weather. Scrubbed, decided, reset. Nadia was awake at 04:30, dressed by 04:35, sitting on the edge of the cot with her father's rifle across her lap by 04:40, doing nothing in particular except being present with the weight of it. 5 days had come to this. She didn't rehearse. She didn't run scenarios or visualization sequences. She just sat with the rifle and remembered. Her father's voice. His hands over hers. The Nevada morning. The ground still cool from the night. The particular patience of a man who knew that the most important things could not be acquired on a schedule and had built his entire way of living around that understanding. You are not trying to become accurate, he had told her once. You already are. You are just remembering it. She had thought that was something fathers said. At 31, after 2 wars and 1 week at Quantico, she understood it was precise. At 05:30, Garza's counterpart, a gunnery sergeant named Reese, appeared at her door followed by 2 men in civilian clothes whose carriage said everything their clothing tried not to say. He spoke for 4 minutes. She listened. Lieutenant Colonel Farr had been placed under investigation. Davis and Martinez had provided statements. The equipment access had been traced to a senior logistics officer named Pollard, who had been using his master key access to assist in what the investigators were now classifying as a coordinated effort to interfere with competition outcomes. The broken scope assignment on day 1, the ammunition, the missing schedule, the phone access, all documented, all attributable. Farr would not be on the range today. Do you have any questions? Reese said. No, she said. Then she sat on the edge of the cot for a long moment after they left and thought about Farr. Not with satisfaction, with something more complicated. He was genuinely skilled. She had watched him shoot for 4 days, and he was one of the finest technical marksmen she had seen in competition. He had built something real and then used it in service of something small. That was the specific waste of a man who had more talent than character and didn't know the difference until the distance between the two became documented and permanent. She picked up the rifle, ran her thumb along the stock where her father's hand had worn it smooth over 30 years of daily handling. There are 2 kinds of people, she thought. The kind who, when they encounter something better than they are, try to dismantle it. And the kind who, when they encounter something better than they are, try to understand it. Farr had been the first kind. Vic had been the second. The distance between those 2 choices was not small. It was the distance between a career that ended in an investigation and a life up that ended with something worth inheriting. She stood up. There was still a final day to shoot. The briefing had 12 competitors instead of 16. Reese ran it. The remaining 12 had the specific quality of people who had been through something genuine and knew it. They were serious people, and the room had the quality of a room where everyone present had earned their seat. General Keene stood at the front with his hands clasped behind his back and looked at 12 faces with something that was close to respect, which was a different thing from approval and a more valuable one. Final day, he said. The championship challenge is a cumulative cold bore series. 13 shots, 400 yards to 1,500 yards, 100 yards of additional distance for each subsequent shot, no re-zero between positions, no adjustments between shots except your own calculation. 1 shot per distance. He looked at the room. I designed this challenge 14 years ago, and I have run it at 4 previous invitationals. The range record is 11 of 13. No competitor has completed the series. He paused. He looked at the room with the expression of a man who knows something the room doesn't yet. I believe this group will change that. Be at the range at 0900. That's all. She found Vic outside the briefing room. He fell into step beside her without preamble, in the way of 2 people who had established a rhythm over 4 days and no longer needed to negotiate it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're going to do something today that none of us are going to forget." She walked for a moment. "I'm going to shoot the way my father taught me," she said. "Everything else is details." The challenge began at 0915, lane 7, same as day 1. Some assignments felt like something other than coincidence. She went prone, cleared her mind in the way she cleared a chamber, completely, on purpose until only what was necessary remained. 400 yards. The shot went center before she was fully conscious of the process. The process had been running for 22 years, and it didn't require her conscious attention anymore. It required her to stay out of its way. 500 yards, center, 600, 700. On the observation platform above, she could hear footsteps arriving, more than had been there at the start, men drawn from other parts of the base, by the current that moves through enclosed communities when something is happening that people sense without being told. She didn't look up. Looking up was the request she wasn't making. 800 yards. The wind had come in from the northwest at 11 miles per hour consistent, with a variance pattern she'd been cataloging since she arrived at the lane. At 800, 11 miles per hour meant approximately 13 inches of drift over the bullet's flight. She moved the front post by exactly the amount her hands knew without consultation and fired center, 900 yards. 1,000. The range was very quiet now. Not gradually. It had crossed a threshold somewhere around 900 and gone silent all at once. The way water crosses a threshold and becomes something else. 1,100. She heard someone on the platform say something she couldn't make out, and then silence. 1,200, 1,300. The target at 1,300 was a shape at the edge of the distance, and she used the aperture the way her father had taught her to use it in low Nevada light, as a frame rather than a precision instrument, gathering what was available and trusting the synthesis of it over the clarity of any individual data point. She fired. "Hit," the radio said. 1,300, center. And the platform made a sound that wasn't a word, the involuntary sound of people whose composure has been exceeded by the material in front of them. 1,400 yards. She repositioned, the final distance before the record distance. She breathed through it the way she breathed through everything, steadily at the rate the work required. She fired, hit 1,400, center, and the platform was quiet again, absolutely quiet, in the way of people who have stopped reacting and started witnessing. 1,500 yards. The range record was 11 of 13. Nobody had ever completed the series. She was at 13 of 13 with this shot remaining. She settled into the final position. The aperture framed the space where the target was. Not the target itself. The target at 1,500 yards with iron sights is not a thing you see. It is a thing you know. Her father had spent 20 years building that knowing into her at 6 in the morning in the Nevada desert with the sun just clearing the mountains and the air still cool enough to behave predictably. He had given her this moment without knowing he was giving her this moment. She breathed out. In the pause between the exhale and the breath that followed, when the body goes briefly still enough to be trusted, she broke the trigger. The bullet traveled for approximately 2 seconds. During those 2 seconds, the range was so still that Keene, standing at the platform railing, said afterward that he heard nothing at all, not even his own heartbeat, just waiting. Then the radio. Hit, the scoring officer said. 1,500 yards. Dead center. What happened on the platform was not the response of a professional military audience at a controlled exercise. It was the response of human beings who had just watched something they would be describing 30 years from now. Not applause, not organized. The completely involuntary collective sound of people who have run out of the professional equipment necessary to remain neutral. Keene gripped the railing. He looked at the range below, where Nadia Sullen was clearing her weapon and standing and becoming aware, for the first time all week, of the sound above her. And he felt, in the specific way that men who have spent 40 years among exceptional people rarely feel, the specific privilege of presence, the privilege of being in the room when a thing happens that will be recounted to people who weren't there for the rest of the lives of everyone who was. He turned to Crest. "Get the ceremony room ready," he said. "Tonight, full dress." All branches present. She found Vic waiting at the staging area, and his face was the most open she'd seen it in 4 days. The careful reserve of 23 years completely set aside. He looked at her and didn't speak for a long moment. 13 of 13, he said finally. 1,500 yards. Iron sights. She looked at him. "My father did harder things in worse conditions," she said. "I'm just the proof that he taught it right." Vic held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "He did." And that was the fullest sentence the week had produced. The ceremony was at 1900 in the base assembly room. Every chair filled before the doors opened, men standing along the walls. Word had moved the way word moves inside military bases, not through official channels but through the human ones. And every person in that room had arrived at their own version of the story and come to see how it ended. Nadia stood at the front in dress uniform, her father's rifle in her hands. She had been asked twice whether she preferred to have it placed on the ceremony table, and she had said no both times without elaboration. Keene stood before the assembled room. Crest stood to his right. The room held the specific silence of people who are already present and don't need to be called to attention because attention is what they already have. Keene spoke without notes. 4 days ago, he said, a specialist brought an iron-sighted rifle to a competition designed for the best long-range marksman in the American military. She was told directly and indirectly, through action and inaction and the practiced language of institutional doubt, that she did not belong here. He paused. She shot a perfect qualification on day 1. She shot 13 of 13 on the championship challenge today, including a 1,500-yard cold-bore hit that has never been accomplished in the history of this invitational. He looked at the room. That is what was visible this week. What was not visible until recently is the story of where that came from. He turned to Crest, who stepped forward with a small official envelope. "Raymond Sullen," Keene said, and the name filled the room with the weight of years behind it, was a range master and precision shooter in Elko County, Nevada, from 1987 to 2014. He qualified for inclusion in the National Precision Fire Registry 3 times. His applications were lost, delayed, and administratively voided through failures that were systemic rather than intentional, and that produced an outcome indistinguishable from deliberate erasure. He paused. That failure is the institution's, not his. He looked at Nadia. "Tonight, with the authorization of Brigadier General Crest, I am initiating the posthumous inclusion of Raymond Sullen in the National Precision Fire Registry, and the submission of his 1991 qualification record for the historical recognition that documentation confirms he earned." He crossed to her. He held the official letter of inclusion notification for a moment before he extended it. Not for ceremony, because he was a man who understood what he was holding, and he wanted that understanding to be visible to everyone in the room before he transferred it to the person it belonged to. He placed it in her right hand. She looked at it, her father's name, typed in the clean official font of something that had finally arrived at the place it had been trying to reach for 30 years. Raymond James Sullen, Elko County, Nevada. Range master, marksman, the things he'd been, acknowledged now in the language of the institution that should have acknowledged them when he was alive to receive it. She felt him in the room, not as invention, as the quality of presence that people leave in the things they've spent their lives building. He was in the rifle in her left hand. He was in the letter in her right hand. He was in every shot she'd fired this week, and in every morning that had produced every shot, and in every hour her father had stood beside her in the Nevada heat, making her into the instrument she was, without recognition, without registry, without anything except the knowledge that the work was right and that the work deserved to survive him. She looked up at the room, 12 remaining competitors, officers from 4 branches, range staff and evaluators and investigators, and Vic, standing near the back with his arms folded and an expression that was doing significant work to remain composed and mostly failing. She looked at all of them. Then she looked at the front row, where Farr was not sitting and where the empty chair was its own statement about the kind of week it had been and the kind of choices men made when they encountered things they hadn't prepared themselves to encounter. She breathed. She pressed the letter against her chest. Keene raised his voice to the room one final time. "What this week proved," he said, "is something we needed reminding of. We have come to trust our platforms more than our people. We have confused technical capacity with the thing that technical capacity is supposed to serve." He looked at Nadia. Specialist Sullen reminded us this week that warriors are not made by their equipment. Warriors are made by the people who teach them. He looked at the room, and the man who made this warrior deserved to be in the registry of remarkable things a long, long time before tonight. The room rose, not on a signal, not as a coordinated response. Each person rose when they arrived at the same place through their own route, and they arrived in a wave from the front to the back, chair by chair, until every person in the room was standing. The sound they made was not applause. It was sustained and genuine, and it filled the room completely. And Nadia stood at the front of it and held her father's rifle in one hand and his recognition in the other, and she let the sound move through her without trying to contain it. She had spent her entire career doing the work because the work was right, and because her father had made her understand that the doing was its own justification, with or without the acknowledgement that followed. But when the acknowledgement came, after 30 years of waiting and 4 days of proof, it arrived with the full weight of everything that had been withheld. And it was heavier than she had imagined, and it was exactly as necessary. She felt his hand on her shoulder. The way she had felt it every morning in Nevada when the air was still cool and the rifle was in her hands and all the lessons were still ahead of them, and neither of them knew yet what those lessons were going to be required to do. She pressed the letter against her chest. Raymond James Sullen was in the registry now. His name was in the right file. The acknowledgement was irrevocable, and it was finally completely 30 years late and exactly on time.